Order, please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Despite overwhelming evidence that the film tax credit changes will wipe out an entire industry employing 2,000 of our young, bright Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, we're all waiting to hear from the Premier on whether changes will be made. The industry itself says that the film tax credit changes are not workable. And based on reports coming out of the meeting with the Finance Minister this morning, they say that the Finance Department agrees. As Mark Allman of Screen Nova Scotia is quoted as saying that they have agreed that the changes they make are not workable, Mr. Speaker. But I'd like to ask the Premier, in light of all this evidence and the fact he spent the last week defending his changes in this House, does he now agree with everybody else that the changes in the budget on the film tax credit are not workable?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to make it clear to all members of this House what this government believes is that the program that is in place today, Mr. Speaker, at 50% and 65% is not sustainable in this province. Let me be clear. We laid out a plan that works for our government, Mr. Speaker, and we believe works for the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. What we said today was, though, if they have another option, if they have another way to move this forward that fits in the fiscal envelope that this province has to offer, we're more than prepared to listen. Mr. Speaker, everyone in this House knows how reasonable I am, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but it would have been awfully nice if they had actually consulted with the industry and listened to what they had to say before all of this mess was created. Mr. Speaker, fact of the matter is, real projects are being lost. Real jobs have been lost. That all could have been avoided if the Premier just followed his own law, because just a few months ago they passed the Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia Act, which calls for independent reviews before changing the film tax credit. Why did the Premier ignore his own law in the first place? Was he hoping that no one would notice?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the film tax credit exists in this province, Mr. Speaker. It still exists on the changes that were made before. Mr. Speaker, all the criteria that was in last month is still in today, Mr. Speaker. The only difference is the way that that money is distributed out to the producers.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it appears everybody but the Premier agrees that the changes that he made in his budget are not workable. Real jobs are being lost, real projects are being cancelled, Mr. Speaker, and it could have all been avoided. In fact, in the government's own bill, in the last session, they enacted a law that there should be a review of the tax credit that looks at the cost and the benefits to our province by March the 1st, 2015. I'll ask the Premier, did that review take place, and if so, did he follow it when he put together this budget?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to tell all members of this House and all Nova Scotians who are listening, there's $6 million set aside for digital media, Mr. Speaker, in this province. It's a tremendous investment, Mr. Speaker. We also have an investment, Mr. Speaker, so that musicians actually can take advantage of some of the tax credits that are in this province, Mr. Speaker. How proud we are. We're known around the world for the musicians that come out of this province. Why should we invest in them, Mr. Speaker? As well as, Mr. Speaker, we have invested in the music industry, Mr. Speaker. The same criteria that existed last month existed this month. How the money is distributed is the only difference.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we've had some time now over the last few days to really assess the impact of last week's budget and understand what it means for the screen industry. And what we're hearing more and more is concern being voiced not only from the industry, Mr. Speaker, but from outside the industry. Yesterday, the Mayor of Halifax said, and I quote, "The changes that have been made are quite dramatic and will have a disproportionate impact on film production in the Halifax region." So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Premier to explain how Mayor Mike Savage understands the terrible impact this will have on our community and province, but his government doesn't.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would say to you that Mayor Savage does not have the good fortune that the members of this cabinet or this government has, Mr. Speaker. We know the mess that the former NDP government left us with, Mr. Speaker, and we know the status quo is unacceptable. We've made a decision. We made an investment, in the creative economy, Mr. Speaker, and we're moving forward, Mr. Speaker. If they have a better way for us to spend inside of that envelope, we're more than prepared to listen to them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a government who in less than 2 years has picked fights with nurses home care and other workers in the healthcare sector, but that wasn't good enough for them, Mr. Speaker. They're now creating chaos in another important sector, the screen industry. So my question to the Premier is this. Why hasn't your government learned that having a majority government doesn't give carte blanche to govern without meaningful consultation and respect for people's livelihoods?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would say to you that on October 13th, Nova Scotia has asked us to provide a government that showed leadership and changed the direction for this province, and that's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. Time and time again, Mr. Speaker, what we hear from the other side of the House is the status quo. Mr. Speaker, the status quo has provided us the worst performing economy in Canada and has held us behind. Mr. Speaker, we're moving forward.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I dare say they voted for a government that made a promise to expand the tax credit, not break that promise, Mr. Speaker. The film industry has built up over several decades, and we can argue till the cows come home about the actual dollar value, Mr. Speaker, but what is indisputable is that the industry has grown, and it's made a significant difference to the recruitment and the retention of the very group of people our province desperately needs: the young, the well-educated, the innovative, the creative, the hard-working women and men who want to call Nova Scotia home, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, why won't you suspend your decision until the industry is properly consulted and a reasonable plan is in place that will ensure the industry isn't damaged beyond repair?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me correct the Leader of the Democratic Party. As the tax credit has been going up, Mr. Speaker, the percentage that's been happening in Nova Scotia of the Canadian film industry is going down, Mr. Speaker. So let me be clear on that. Second of all, Mr. Speaker, we have laid out to the industry a fiscal envelope, Mr. Speaker. We've laid out a way to move forward with it. If they see a better way that works, Mr. Speaker, we'll be more than prepared to listen.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It turns out the film industry isn't the only area where the government has made a mess this week. Healthcare, and specifically obstetric services for women, is now in turmoil across the province. Once again, the government has gone and blindly made changes, in this case to the malpractice fees that our obstetricians pay, without regard to the consequences of the delivery of health care, particularly in rural areas. Mr. Speaker, as Dr. Robin McQuarrie so eloquently pointed out here in this building this morning, people are leaving. That's the reality. For example, Antigonish will have no obstetrical health service as of May the 15th unless the government changes course. So I'd like to say to the Premier, I'd like to ask him, what does he have to say to the expectant mothers in Antigonish and across rural Nova Scotia who are losing their obstetric services?
The Honourable Premier.
I thank the Honourable Member for the question, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Doctors Nova Scotia who have worked on behalf of doctors across this province. They worked with the Minister of Health and Department of Health. They've come to a successful conclusion of that. If there are doctors across this province who are not happy, I suggest they call Doctors Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Doctors Nova Scotia is not responsible or accountable for delivery of health services to women in Nova Scotia, rural or urban. The Premier and the Minister of Health are. To pass off responsibility for the lack of obstetric service is not acceptable, Mr. Speaker. It's not the first time. They messed up the film industry. They messed up the Limitation of Actions Bill. They messed up the Flavoured Tobacco Bill. Now, real women in rural areas are going to go without obstetric services. So I'll ask the Premier, will he assure the women of Nova Scotia today who rely on this important health service, regardless of where they live in the province, that not another obstetrician will be lost while they consider what to do?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for his question. I want to, first of all, thank the Minister of Health for the tremendous job he's been doing, Mr. Speaker, to break down walls inside of healthcare, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the money we're spending are being focused on patients, Mr. Speaker. And I want to remind the Honourable Member it's Doctors Nova Scotia who negotiated on behalf of doctors, Mr. Speaker. It's Doctors Nova Scotia who negotiated with the Minister of Health and Department of Health to come up with this agreement and settlement. I would suggest to you that the members of Doctors Nova Scotia who are not happy call Doctors Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Mr. Speaker, 6 obstetricians have now tendered their resignation in communities across the province as a result of the government's refusal to uphold an existing agreement it had with these specialists. These obstetricians were near retirement, but willing to continue to work until suitable replacements could be found. Now women in Sydney could find themselves travelling all the way to New Glasgow, Mr. Speaker, to give birth. So I'd like to ask the Minister, will the Minister acknowledge the serious problems his government has created by failing to uphold the agreement it had with obstetricians respecting malpractice insurance fees?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. This is a very, very important area to make sure that women's health and the delivery of babies across the province is in fact in place in as full a measure as we can. There has been an offer, of course, that Doctors Nova Scotia accepted. We know this is a dramatic increase, and I'm not going to say CMPA is fully the problem here. Negotiations are going on, and I know that we will reach a fair agreement. Nobody will be disadvantaged, and we have the ability for retroactivity if that is required.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Mr. Speaker, these specialists recognize the need to negotiate into the future. We're talking about going back with an agreement that was signed and breaking that agreement. Obstetricians rely on locum physicians to help provide coverage, especially in rural Nova Scotia. 2 of Nova Scotia's locum obstetricians now say they will no longer accept new patients as a result of the treatment by the McNeil government. Amherst obstetrician Dr. Robin McQuarrie, who's with us today, fears the McNeil government's plan is ultimately to have Halifax be the only other region that you can go to give birth, Mr. Speaker. Are these cuts to obstetric services in rural communities what Nova Scotians should expect from their new centralized healthcare system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I've spoken personally with several of the obstetrician gynecologists across the province. They know that we are looking at a provincial plan to make sure that from Amherst to Sydney, Bridgewater through to Yarmouth, we will have a plan in place into the future that will make sure that in our regional hospitals there will be obstetrician and gynecologists in place. This dramatic CMPA fee increase has caught everybody off guard. Every province is working through it, and we will here as well in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Because of what I've been listening to here, the Minister is walking away from a commitment to reimburse obstetrician gynecologists for huge malpractice fees. Rural OBGYNs feel that they have 2 choices: stay here in Nova Scotia and go bankrupt, or leave the province. And I guess they'll be following all those Nova Scotians involved in the film industry as they leave this province as well. So why is the Minister going out of his way to drive professionals who deliver important health services to women out of the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know that in dealing with Doctors Nova Scotia, they are pleased with that current level that is on the table. At 80% of the fees, and it still remains one of the issues that are part of the ongoing negotiations.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
These specialists felt that they had a binding contract with government and were shocked to receive a letter that said, sorry, we don't have the money, so we're not going to fulfill that contract. The Minister has characterized this issue as a negotiation ploy, but that's not fair to the physicians involved, and certainly not to the women who rely on those services. The only one, Mr. Speaker, that is using this as a negotiation ploy is the Minister himself, and that's actually, I don't even know where to go with that. So why is the government and the Minister using the health of rural women as a bargaining chip in physician-master agreement negotiations.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. When we hear back from Doctors Nova Scotia that they are the voice. They are the voice of doctors in the province, whether it's a specialist or GP. They are satisfied at this stage, and we will continue to deal with Doctors Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. As the Minister knows, the River John Consolidated School has been on our radar since the last election, as it is slated for potential closing. Last year, during estimates, the Minister stated to me that she felt that the school had a very good chance in staying open with the Save Our School Committee, following the criteria in developing a proposal for a hub model school. Does the Minister still believe this, and perhaps can give us an update? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member. Of course, I know River John is important to her, and as it is to all members of the community and other communities around the province. River John, Maitland, and Wentworth were schools that Chignecto Central School Board had asked to put together something of a model, hub model approach to the sustainability of those schools, and I had an opportunity to meet with one representative from each of those three groups. I was encouraged by the work the communities have done, and I wish them well as they make their presentation.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her interest and the answer to my question. I'm just wondering, as we know, this coming Wednesday will be the Save Our Committee or Save Our School Committee's last opportunity to present in Truro. I'm wondering if the Minister has actually watched the presentation. It's been on a PowerPoint presentation for some time, and if she will be present Wednesday night for us to give that presentation.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And when I met with one representative from each of those three school communities, they were pretty clear in expressing and explaining to me the proposal that they had put forward. All three communities were different. It was very obvious that they were. And the River John group certainly had an excellent presentation. That is going before the school board. I will not be attending. That is a school board initiative.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can't believe that after 18 months, the Premier is still blaming the former government for the many mistakes and broken promises that he and his government have made. Today I heard the Premier in an earlier response trying to blame the NDP for his decision to gut the film and television tax credit, a credit that the NDP actually improved and strengthened. So there are several different people working in the industry that I know. For instance, Jonathan Torrens, Jason Eisner, and Josh McDonald, all wonderful and talented people, young men who live in Colchester County and the Halifax region. And they have put down
Member have a question.
So my question is, will the Premier please explain to Jonathan, Jason, and Josh why he expects them now to have to move on down the road like so many before them?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to correct the Honourable Member. What I said was the financial mess that the former government left us in, Mr. Speaker. Take strategic measures, Mr. Speaker. We've had to make decisions. Mr. Speaker, last week there were men and women who worked for this government on Friday morning for the people of this province who were given, Mr. Speaker, that told that day they no longer had a job. Think that's easy? Of course it isn't. Those decisions weigh heavy, Mr. Speaker, on all members of government when you're making decisions that affect the lives of all Nova Scotians. What we're trying to do is strike a balance to get this government, get this province back to a fiscal reality that it can live with and one that allows us to move forward.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm sure it will provide cold comfort for those people who've lost their jobs and the people who are about to lose all their jobs in the film, television, and animation industry, as well as all of the little country towns where all these shows have been being performed and played for many years. So in the past 2 summers, for instance, Trailer Park Boys has rented dozens of hotels for months on end. They've bought building materials, car costumes, purchase food for the crew who on nights and weekends frequent Jamali's, Frank and Gino's, the Nook and Cranny, and the Horseman's Club in Truro. They buy gas and groceries and necessities. So my question for the Premier is, what solutions does he have to offer Colchester County in order to replace this vital industry that is now going to be lost?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank members, Mr. Speaker, who are working in the film industry in this province for the tremendous work they've done. I want to thank them for the collaborative approach they brought to meeting with the Minister of Finance today. Very clearly, both of us laid out our sides of this issue. We've had a conversation. We'll meet again next week, Mr. Speaker, or we'll meet again, on Friday. Hopefully with a solution that will fit within the financial challenges facing this province, Mr. Speaker. So we're doing what Nova Scotians have asked us to, Mr. Speaker, which is listen.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Following the release of the provincial budget, the Liberal government decided to cut the community counts page from the Department of Finance's website. This page displayed a large amount of information on statistics related to our province, and this information was invaluable to groups working in the community. So closing down a website that was of assistance to non-profit groups is a perfect illustration, I'm afraid, of the Liberal government's misplaced priorities and aversion to actually being open and transparent. So my question is, why did the government decide to hide this important information about the province from community groups and Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate having the opportunity to answer the question from the member opposite. Mr. Speaker, this was a program that rests in the Department of Finance. It had 3 people associated with the delivery of that program. It was not well utilized, and in every department of government was asked to find savings within their envelopes to be able to come forward and help us move this province forward to a better place fiscally. Mr. Speaker, the Community Counts website was not used as often as it might have been.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am hearing from Nova Scotians, particularly rural Nova Scotians, that did use this website and rely on this information. And Mr. Speaker, helping Nova Scotians stay informed and providing an accessible database of information is vital. And this is a government that promised to be the most open and transparent government in Canada. I believe maybe it was even in history, Mr. Speaker. Yet they decide to cut a resource that provided essential information about our province's services, demographics, health statistics, and economy. So my question is, what was the government's rationale? What's the government's rationale for hiding this information? And is it simply just a cost matter?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it was certainly done within the fiscal envelope we have to operate in, and because every single department had to show that they were also looking for ways to tighten their belt and show restraint. As the Premier said just a few moments ago, none of the decisions made in this year's budget were taken lightly. They weigh heavily on our hearts when there's people involved in job losses, and it's just a big part of moving forward to a place where we are balanced, where we have a surplus, where the honourable members that are calling for tax cuts can actually see some movement on those fronts and many other important social fronts as well.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, people who live in rural Nova Scotia are feeling they've been forgotten by this government, only to be remembered when fees are being increased. Prospects for a good-paying job or close to home are not improving. Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate for youth in rural Nova Scotia was 21% in 2014, and the national average is 12.2%, and I will table that. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Business is this. For the sake of young people who want good jobs and a clear vision for rural Nova Scotia, would the Minister inform this House of the government's specific plans to address youth unemployment in rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. As the member knows, we're presently in the process of transition with the presence of the new Department of Business. And we've heard loud and clear from the private sector how important it is for government to get out of the way and allow them the opportunity to drive the economy of Nova Scotia and inherently employment. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to the outcomes of that work relationship with the private sector, and in the future we'll continue to have discussions and dialogue with the member opposite.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, hard-working rural Nova Scotians want to be able to pursue new opportunities in the private sector in rural Nova Scotia. New opportunities which could come from tax relief for small businesses and families, employment opportunities that could come from the film industry, responsible resource development and other emerging sectors. My question for the Minister is this. Rural communities are partners, not obstacles for economic growth. Will this government recognise that a thriving rural economy will benefit all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I thank the member opposite for the question. The member has obviously read the contents of the Ivany report. Some of the objectives, economic development recommendations that have been made in the report, the member has referenced. We'll continue to work with the private sector, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can maximise those opportunities for youth in rural Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, Caelan O'Neill has worked on every season of Haven as a daily assistant director. While the Premier is trying to win over the public to his cut of the film tax credit by pretending it's a tax shelter for LA movie stars, it's actually Nova Scotians like Caelan that will feel the brunt of the cut. My question, Mr. Speaker, is Caelan O'Neill is here in the gallery with us today. Does the Premier have any advice to give her now that his changes to the film tax credit has cost Caelan her job in another season of Haven?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to thank Caelan for the tremendous work that she's been doing, Mr. Speaker, on that series. I want to tell Caelan that the film tax credit, Mr. Speaker, still exists. Our criteria still exists, Mr. Speaker. That was here last month. It's here today. What we're talking about is how we distribute that money out to the production, Mr. Speaker. There's still 25% of it. The other 75% is against taxes. But, Mr. Speaker, I also want to tell Haven that the Minister of Finance has met with representatives from the industry. We've given them our fiscal envelope and encouraged them, if they have a way that works better for the industry, that allows the government to achieve its fiscal outcome, we're more than prepared to listen to them.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier just does not get it. The Warden of Lunenburg has received a letter from Haven's producers advising him that they are pulling up stakes, costing the municipality tax revenue and Lunenburg County businesses a lot of spin-off economic activity. What will the Premier do to give Lunenburg County a shot in the arm now that he has cut the legs out from under local film production?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I completely disagree with the honourable member's question. Mr. Speaker, what we have done, the film tax credit is still in place. What we changed is the criteria of how we distribute it. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the work that we've been doing across this province and the investment, Mr. Speaker. Very encouraged about the work that we've been doing with all sectors to drive economic growth. Mr. Speaker, we've seen an increase in our population. Very encouraged by that. Encouraged by the new ventures that we're seeing outside. Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraged by the way the private sector has come forward to help drive that job growth and economic development. I'm very encouraged by the way the Department of Labour and Advanced. Mr. Speaker, they're still wanting me to answer, so I'm going to continue to respond, Mr. Speaker. Very encouraged by the way the Labour and Advanced Education is laying out stuff to support workers and employers to be able to create jobs, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that the film industry has come and sat down with the Minister of Finance, looking at the fiscal envelope they had, and providing us with an alternative that fits within the financial challenges left behind by that government.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you is to the Minister of Health. Today we heard that 6 obstetricians have resigned, 2 in Sydney, 2 in Antigonish. And contrary to what the Premier says, this is not about Doctors Nova Scotia. This is not about obstetricians losing their jobs. It's about young women being put in jeopardy. It's about people outside of Halifax having to drive miles to get services that are crucial to their onboard children's health and to their own health. What does the minister have to say to these young expecting mothers who need these obstetricians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know over the last few weeks there has been a concern, a strong concern expressed by the obstetrician gynecologists in the province. We've reached out and have worked with Doctors Nova Scotia. They have agreed to the current level of settlement, and we'll move from there over the next few weeks during negotiations.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning Dr. McQuarrie was very clear. She said, my concern is that women in labour are going to have to drive up to 5 or 6 hours, and that's not good health care, Mr. Speaker. Imagine a loved one that has to drive 4 to 6 hours to receive services of an obstetrician. Imagine a mother has a troubled pregnancy who needs to travel in order for her to get the kind of quality care she needs. Can the minister tell expecting mothers how their services do not meet the financial goals of his department?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much for the question to the honourable member. And in terms of services, it is the department's understanding that all of our regional hospitals have service in place at this time. And perhaps when I get an update this afternoon, there may be some additional information. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. As the Minister knows, many individuals charged with crimes have underlying mental health issues and would benefit from having their charges heard in mental health court. But mental health court is not available throughout the province, only in HRM. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Justice is, can the Minister inform this House of her plans to make mental health court available throughout rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to my colleague for that very important question. Providing access to justice is, for all Nova Scotians, is our priority. We do have the mental health court in Dartmouth, the one that you're referring to, but we do have other services available throughout Nova Scotia. In fact, last year we launched a drug treatment plan with the hospital there in the valley as well, and we do have other services throughout the province and other initiatives that are currently going on, actually, that will address the question, and I can respond more. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I thank the Minister for the answer and do recognise her comments about the drug services available in the Annapolis Valley. I'm wondering, Mr. Speaker, if in the meanwhile, can the Minister inform this House if a person seeking to be heard in mental health court in rural Nova Scotia would have the option of having that heard in the HRM mental health court?
The Honourable Minister of Health. Justice. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you again for that very important question. It's very difficult to speak about specific cases because each case depends on specifically the specific facts of that case. If you have any that you would like us to look into, we'd be happy to do that. But there's certainly definitely services available throughout the province for people that have mental health conditions that are facing our court system and have challenges there. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The Minister and the Liberal government announced in the budget they were closing 7 courthouses across the province. One of those closures was in Badek. What points did the member of Victoria the Lakes raise with the Minister to oppose the closure of her local courthouse?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a very, very important question. I really do thank my colleague for raising that. Providing timely access to justice for all Nova Scotians is a priority in the Department of Justice. I do acknowledge that for some it will be inconvenient to travel a bit longer. But, Mr. Speaker, balance that with the fact that we're going to have safer, more secure facilities. Balance that with the fact that we're going to have
faster service. Balance that with the fact that people will have faster arraignment. People will have faster trial dates. Judges and staff, instead of traveling on the roads, will now be sitting in the courtrooms hearing cases. And specifically for Badek, Mr. Speaker, it's a satellite court. It sits 3 times on 3 Tuesdays in 1 month. The caseloads have been decreasing. There are no staff losses. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the minister's comments, but I didn't hear an answer to the question. Mr. Speaker, people in Victoria the Lakes are already reeling from the huge increases in the ferry fees at Englishtown. They were no doubt shocked to hear their courthouse was also targeted by the government. Will the minister offer what points did the member from Victoria the Lakes raise with the minister to oppose the closure of the courthouse?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much. Very, very important. And one thing I did not mention, we've got safety and security concerns in these satellite courts. The specific one in Badek, and the colleague may or may not know, it's not wheelchair accessible either. That was another consideration. But again, balance everything that you're speaking about with the fact that we are looking at access to justice issues here. With the fact that it's sitting 3 times a month, our caseloads are decreasing, our justice and our court staff are having difficulties getting to these courtrooms. This is the best for the people of Nova Scotia and for the people in that area. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Finance Minister defended the McNeill government's slashing of the film tax credit by saying that there is no tax credit or subsidy available to any other industry that's of this nature that is this generous. And Mr. Speaker, that is technically accurate, but somewhat misleading, Mr. Speaker, because the Finance Minister fully knows that there are tax credits available to other sectors that aren't available to the film tax industry. Mr. Speaker, for example, right now the government is offering a manufacturing tax credit valued at $33 million. And let's not forget the more than $40 million the government has given to the Yarmouth Ferry in the past year. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this. Why has the Premier launched a campaign of disinformation regarding the film industry, attempting to make them look unreasonable, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member may or may not know, this tax credit is a labour-based tax credit. Mr. Speaker, it is the only industry that we pay 50 to 65% of the labour costs associated with, Mr. Speaker. So the reality is the honourable member knows that. I want to tell her again, I want to tell all members of this House, we have a fiscal reality in this province that we're dealing with. We're going to continue to move forward. I'm very encouraged by the film industry coming forward, sitting down with the Minister of Finance, talking about the financial challenges facing this province, talking about the challenges facing their industry, looking to find a way that works for both sides.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very aware of how this tax credit works. Mr. Speaker, in the Liberal platform, the Premier promises, and I quote, to end the practice of picking winners and losers, and will focus on sector development. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the Premier has not kept his commitment in regards to Nova Scotia's creative sector. He's slashing the film tax credit. He's eliminating the sector's primary promotional body, Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia, and he's fired all the staff at ERDT who were responsible for growing the industry. So my question for the Premier is this. Why is developing Nova Scotia's film, television and digital media sector not a priority for his government?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable member and remind her, Mr. Speaker, that not only was the film tax credit in place last month, it's in place this month. Mr. Speaker, in the budget we announced a Creative Economy Fund at $6 million. There's $6 million in the fund for digital media, Mr. Speaker, where it's actually looking at the creative economy in a broad sense, Mr. Speaker. We're very encouraged by that, Mr. Speaker, but I also want to remember all members of this House that under the leadership of that member, We settled collective agreements that were 2%, 2.5%, and 3%. Mr. Speaker, was a $700 million wage embedded into the cost of running government. Speaker, just imagine, Mr. Speaker, if we had kept that at the growth of the economy, we'd have an additional $200 million today to spend, Mr. Speaker. That would make a $100 million surplus, Mr. Speaker. Just imagine what we could invest in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Business. Last week, Nova Scotia received a budget that showed how much importance this government places on small business. In fact, the Finance Minister's budget address did not even mention small businesses. Yet, before the last election, the Premier said it's time for Nova Scotians to have a provincial government that recognizes the hard-working Nova Scotians, and small businesses are the backbone of our economy. So my question for the Minister, does the Minister agree that maintaining high taxes and finding new ways to tax small business owners hurts small business and hurts all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for the question. With the shift in direction, very clear through the Ivany report that we can't continue to do things the way we've done. And the new Department of Business is intended to address that, Mr. Speaker. And it includes all businesses, small businesses and large businesses. But I want to remind the member across the floor, the CFIB, Canadian Federation of Independent Business, has endorsed this budget and the components in there for small business.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wasn't aware there had been a shift in direction since the Premier said small business was so important. So I'm happy to know that. And while there's no tax relief offered to small businesses, we know that the government will collect an extra $30 million from small businesses by lowering the non-eligible dividend tax credit. Small businesses in this province need a government that understands that high taxes hurt job creation. This government wants the private sector to lead, with government helping to create the conditions for growth. High taxes do not help small businesses grow. So my question for the Minister, does the Minister feel that high taxes are the road to job creation?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member across the floor, obviously, with his background, understands the probabilities of balance and the need for fairness in our economic system. The position is quite simply this, Mr. Speaker: the province is broke, and everybody will have to contribute to right the ship. That includes all members of the business community. They've recognized that, and the components in this budget, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the largest single representative of small business in this province, supports our budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
I'll get him. Mr. Speaker, my question's to the Premier. The McNeil government's fight first and talk later attitude has many small businesses in our province worried, especially those who rely on the creative sector as a source of income. Yesterday we heard from Natalie Chevary, owner of the Food Wolf food truck, whose livelihood depends on work from the film industry. Ms. Chevary is now afraid her business and income will disappear because this government gutted the film tax credit. And she said, the cut to the film tax credit is going to hurt businesses.
Does the member have a question?
Yes, and I do, and it's going to be hard to see people leave. What does the Premier have to say to Ms. Chevary about where their next job will come from when the film industry disappears in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Ms. Chivry for her work, Mr. Speaker, believing in our province, creating her own niche in her respective community, Mr. Speaker, creating jobs across the province, Mr. Speaker. I'm always encouraged by the ingenuity of Nova Scotians and the entrepreneurial spirit that I see as I travel this province. I also want to say to her that I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, that the film industry has come together with the Minister of Finance. We've laid out our financial challenges, financial envelope that's available, Mr. Speaker, and they're working with us to see if there's a solution we can find, Mr. Speaker, that will allow them to go forward, Mr. Speaker, in the way that they see fit and allow the province, Mr. Speaker, to get our province back to fiscal health.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope the film tax industry has one more movie to do called Hollow Words. It's clear that this government has no idea of the real impact of gutting the film tax credit. In fact, on Budget Day, the Minister of Finance admitted she and her department have no idea what the impact will be, and I'll table that. Well, we know, Mr. Speaker, it's about dozens and dozens of businesses that are going to be going under. Will the Premier commit today to finally do a full analysis of the impact this move will have on Nova Scotia's economy, especially the impact on our smaller businesses?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank the Minister of Finance for the tremendous job she's been doing, Mr. Speaker, to right this ship. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who responded to this budget in such a positive way, recognizing that all of us are going to have a role to play, Mr. Speaker, in getting this province back to fiscal health. And I want to remind the honourable member across the way, Mr. Speaker, it was her government. She was a member of a cabinet that voted for 2%, 2.5% and 3% pay raises, Mr. Speaker. We embedded $700 million in the cost of doing government in this province, Mr. Speaker. If they had kept pace with the growth in the economy, we'd have $200 million to invest in so many other things, Mr. Speaker. $200 million.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, physicians in rural areas are doing a tremendous job delivering babies when OBGYNs are not available. And as we know, 6 of those resigned today. Mr. Speaker, it takes 2 deliveries each month for these family doctors just to pay their insurance costs. These physicians care and want to help people. They work hard around the clock, yet this government expects them to do work for which they will not get paid. Mr. Speaker, why is the government putting pressure on these physicians at a time when we need more of them in rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. And what I do know is that Doctors Nova Scotia expressed relief, and also were pleased to cover the 80% immediately. And we know that there will be a continuation of talks and moving to a place where we will all agree.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, from my investigation, young rural physicians are encouraged by the expectation that there is lots of work for them in rural Nova Scotia. When they get there, they discover all the challenges that go with rural health care, like the real example I just mentioned. I am told there is no active effort by the government or health authority to check in with these doctors to better understand what they are facing. Can the minister explain why?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Over the past year and a half, I've met probably with about 15 to 20% of the doctors across the province. I know a number of their concerns, and we're at a point now through the new master agreement where, in fact, I think we will find common agreement over the next number of weeks.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're hearing a lot about physicians and physician recruitment here today. The Liberal government has changed their stance and removed the tuition cap for universities. The new change allows universities to increase tuition fees for international students and graduate programs with no limit. Last week, I reminded the Minister of her past statements where she said removing the cap would price Nova Scotia out of the game. And I can table that report, Mr. Speaker. The Physician Resource Plan states that the location of a medical school of graduation is the single biggest factor in determining where physicians decide to practice, and I'll practice that as well. If Dalhousie Medical School increases tuition, our shortage of doctors may increase. So my question is, did the Minister consider that in her decision could have an impact on physician recruitment?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. As the honourable member would know, the tuitions for professional programs have not been capped in the past, and we have continued with that particular policy. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, tuition for graduate programs in other provinces already puts Nova Scotia at a disadvantage. If universities increase these costs any further, we'd be losing young professionals and jobs in this province that we're in desperate need of filling. The minister did not consider the impact of removing the cap could have in our province, nor did she consider the mounting debt already faced by students and their parents. So my question to the minister is, did the minister consult her cabinet colleagues about this decision? And if so, why did she not consider the widespread impact this choice could have on all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Anytime any government makes a decision to increase tuitions, it is a very difficult decision. I understand the impact on the students, and probably better than most because my son-in-law is in fact in medical school. But what I do want to say, I think the member may be in fact referring to the fact that we have maybe allowing universities to look at possibly charging.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that you do now leave the chair and that the House resolve itself into a committee of the whole on supply.
The House will now recess while we get set up for the Committee on Whole House on Supply.